He handed me divorce papers on our 22nd wedding anniversary and told me the ink on the marriage certificate had officially expired, like a coupon. Good day, listeners. It's Eleanor Whitfield here, and I'm 52 years old. Before I continue, like and subscribe and leave your comment. Trust me, you're going to want to talk about this one. I remember the exact moment my life split into a before and after. I had spent the entire afternoon baking his favorite lemon tart, the same recipe I'd made every anniversary since we were 28 years old. I had candles lit. I had a new dress on, one I'd saved up for out of my grocery budget, because God forbid I spend money on myself when there were bills to pay. He walked in at 7, a manila folder tucked under his arm, and Bianca standing behind him in the doorway like she owned the welcome mat. "Richard," I said, "what is she doing here?" "Eleanor, we need to talk," he said, setting the folder on the table right next to my lemon tart, like it was just another piece of mail. "This marriage isn't working anymore. I've found someone who actually makes me happy." I stood there in my new dress, in my own kitchen, in the house I'd scrubbed and decorated and bled for over 2 decades, and I felt the floor tilt sideways. 22 years, I whispered. 22 years, Richard." He didn't even flinch. He just straightened his tie, the same navy one I'd bought him for his 50th birthday, and said the words that would replay in my head for months. 22 years of what, exactly? Cooking and cleaning? Eleanor, be honest with yourself. You gave up your whole life to be a housewife. You don't have a career. You don't have savings. You don't have anything that's actually yours. What are you going to do without me? Starve. Bianca actually laughed, a soft, cruel little laugh like she'd been rehearsing it. She was 26, and she was standing in my kitchen wearing a designer coat that probably cost more than what I spent on groceries in a month, smirking at me like I was a pathetic joke that had finally reached its punchline. "She's right, you know," Bianca said, tilting her head. "A simple housewife like you, without Richard's money, you'll be selling your jewelry within a year just to keep the lights on. I want you to understand something about me, listeners." I did not scream. I did not throw the lemon tart at her perfectly contoured face, though God knows I wanted to. I stood very still, and I let the humiliation wash over me, and somewhere underneath the humiliation, something else started to burn. Something quiet. Something that would take a year to fully catch fire, but once it did, it would never go out. "Sign the papers, Eleanor," Richard said. "Let's not make this ugly." "You already made it ugly," I said, "the moment you brought her into my kitchen." He rolled his eyes like I was being dramatic. 22 years, and he rolled his eyes at me like I was a stranger complaining about bad service at a restaurant. The divorce was fast, and it was brutal. Richard had a lawyer who specialized in protecting assets, which was a polite way of saying he specialized in leaving women like me with nothing. Our house was in his name. His father had given it to him before we married. Some legal technicality I hadn't paid attention to 22 years ago because I trusted him. Our savings account, the one I thought was ours, turned out to be almost entirely drained into investments and expenses I'd never seen a receipt for. I later learned a good chunk of it had quietly paid for Bianca's apartment for the past 8 months. 8 months. He'd been living a double life for 8 months while I was still ironing his shirts. I remember sitting across from my own lawyer, a tired, kind woman named Patricia, who handled mostly modest cases out of a strip mall office, and asking her in a very small voice, "Is there anything I can do? Any of it? Is any of it mine?" Patricia looked at the paperwork Richard's attorney had sent over, then looked at me with something between pity and frustration. "Eleanor, I'm going to be honest with you, because someone should have been honest with you 22 years ago. When you don't put your name on anything, when you don't keep your own accounts, when you let one person control every financial decision in a marriage, this is what's waiting for you on the other side if it ever falls apart. I can fight for a little more. Maybe a few $1,000s more, but he built this exit for himself years before he ever handed you those papers. This wasn't impulsive, Eleanor. This was planned." That sentence sat in my stomach like a stone for weeks. Planned. He hadn't fallen out of love and stumbled into an affair. He had built himself an escape hatch, brick by brick, while I was busy building a home I thought we both lived in. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was watching people I'd known for 2 decades quietly recalculate my worth in real time. At the last dinner party I attended before the divorce was finalized, a woman named Carol, who I used to consider a genuine friend, pulled me aside and said, with the gentlest possible cruelty, "You'll find your footing, Eleanor, I'm sure. It's just, well, Richard's doing so well at the firm now, and Bianca's lovely, honestly, once you get to know her." As if I was supposed to get to know the woman who'd been quietly dismantling my marriage for 8 months. As if my footing was a minor inconvenience compared to Richard's comfort. When the dust settled, I walked away with $11,000, my mother's wedding ring, and a 15-year-old sedan with a check engine light that never turned off. $11,000 after 22 years. My friends, the couple friends Richard and I had built over 2 decades, mostly disappeared. Turns out when you're not part of a couple anymore, you're an inconvenient seating arrangement. A few called to check on me the first month. By the 3rd month, the calls stopped. I sat in a rented studio apartment with water stains on the ceiling, eating cereal for dinner because it was cheap and I didn't have the energy to cook for just myself, and I let myself cry. I let myself feel every single ounce of it. The humiliation, the rage, the grief for a life I thought was solid ground and turned out to be sand. And then one night, I stopped crying. I don't know exactly when it happened. I just remember waking up one morning and instead of dread, I felt something sharper. Clarity. I thought about what Bianca said, a simple housewife like you. I thought about Richard's smug little line, the one he probably practiced in the mirror. "What are you going to do without me? Starve?" I decided right then that my entire life's mission from that point forward was to make both of those sentences the biggest lie either of them had ever told. Here's something people didn't know about me, because I'd buried it under 2 decades of packed lunches and PTA meetings. Before I met Richard, I had a degree in cosmetic chemistry. I used to formulate skincare products in a tiny lab at university, and I was good at it, genuinely, obsessively good at it. I had dreams once of building my own line of clean, effective skincare. Richard used to call it my cute little hobby whenever I brought it up in the early years. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up at all. A dream you don't speak out loud slowly stops feeling real. Mine had been silent for over 20 years, but it wasn't dead. It was just waiting. I took my $11,000 and instead of hoarding it out of fear like every instinct told me to, I made a decision that terrified me. I moved to the city, a real city, 3 hours from the small suburban bubble Richard and I had lived in, where nobody knew my name, where nobody looked at me with pity, where nobody could whisper, "Poor Eleanor left for a younger woman" behind my back at the grocery store. I rented the cheapest studio I could find above a laundromat. I took a part-time job at a department store beauty counter just to keep the lights on, and every single night after my shift, I sat at a secondhand desk and rebuilt my old cosmetic chemistry notes from scratch. I researched, I formulated, I tested products on my own skin until my bathroom looked like a tiny, chaotic laboratory. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I looked in the mirror and decided I was allowed to be beautiful for myself, not for Richard, not for anyone, for me. I started running in the mornings before my shift. I cut out the processed junk I'd been living on out of exhaustion and grief. I saved every spare dollar and invested it in a good haircut, a skin routine using my own formulations, and one good blazer that I wore on repeat like it was a uniform. Slowly, the woman in the mirror started to look less like someone who'd been discarded and more like someone who was building something. I still remember the day I walked into that department store for my beauty counter interview, terrified, convinced a 22-year-old hiring manager was going to take one look at me and laugh me out of the building. Instead, a woman named Priya interviewed me, glanced at my ancient, dusty cosmetic chemistry degree buried at the bottom of my resume, and said, "Wait, you actually understand the science behind this stuff?" Half the girls I hire can't tell me what a humectant does. She hired me on the spot, not out of pity, but because for the first time in years, someone valued the exact knowledge Richard had spent 2 decades calling my cute little hobby. Working that counter did something unexpected to me. Every day, women twice my daughter's age, and women my own age would come up to me, embarrassed, almost apologizing for wanting to feel beautiful again after a divorce. A loss. A hard year. I started genuinely listening to them, formulating little sample mixes in my kitchen based on what I was hearing, testing on my own skin, then quietly letting a few regular customers try them. Their reactions were the first real proof I had that I wasn't just chasing a fantasy. It took nearly a year of 18-hour days, but I created my first product, a restorative overnight serum, gentle enough for mature skin, but powerful enough to rival luxury brands charging 5 times the price. I named the brand Verona, after my grandmother, the only person in my life who ever told me I was capable of more than being someone's wife. I sold my first 100 bottles out of a foldable table at a local farmer's market, hand-labeling every single one at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning the night before. I remember the first time a stranger came back the following week and said, "This serum changed my skin. Do you have more?" I nearly cried in the middle of the market. I remember another woman, maybe 60, holding the little brown bottle like it was something precious, telling me, "Nobody makes anything for skin like mine anymore. Everyone assumes we've stopped caring." I told her we hadn't stopped caring, we'd just stopped being asked. Word spread slowly, then it spread fast. A local boutique agreed to stock Verona after its owner tried the serum herself and called me 2 days later, practically shouting into the phone. Then a regional chain reached out. I reinvested every single dollar of profit back into the brand instead of paying myself, living off my counter job wages, while Verona's earnings went straight into better packaging, better ingredients, better everything. I worked myself to the bone. I learned e-commerce at my kitchen table off free tutorials at midnight. I learned social media by trial and humiliating error, posting shaky videos of myself explaining ingredients until I finally figured out what worked. I learned to read wholesale contracts line by line, so no one could ever again quietly write me out of my own future the way Richard had. All of it from scratch. At 50 years old, while women my age were supposedly past their prime, according to men like Richard, 18 months after I signed those divorce papers, Verona had grown from a foldable table at a farmer's market to a real, functioning company with 6 employees and a small warehouse. It still wasn't easy. Cash flow was a constant nightmare. There were nights I sat at my desk, doing math over and over, trying to figure out how to make payroll without touching the tiny cushion I kept for emergencies, because I had promised myself I would never again be a woman with $11,000 and nothing else standing between her and disaster. I nearly lost everything twice. Once, when a manufacturing deal fell through 3 weeks before a major order was due, forcing me to drive 4 hours overnight to a backup supplier and beg in person for an emergency batch. And once, when a much larger, well-funded knockoff brand copied our packaging almost exactly, right down to the amber glass and the little gold Verona seal, and started undercutting our prices to poach our early customers. I remember calling a lawyer I couldn't afford, sick with panic, certain this was the moment everything collapsed. We won that fight eventually through a cease and desist and a trademark filing I should have completed months earlier, but it taught me a brutal lesson. Building something good isn't enough. You have to be ready to defend it ferociously the second someone tries to take it from you. I never forgot that lesson. It would matter far more than I realized at the time. It was during that second crisis. At an industry networking event, I almost didn't attend because I felt too exhausted and too much like an imposter that I met Marcus Kane. Marcus was a legend in the beauty and retail industry, a self-made titan who had built and sold 2 companies before he turned 40 and was now one of the most sought-after investors and mentors in the business. He had a reputation for being brutally honest and impossible to impress. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of wine I couldn't really afford to be drinking, rehearsing my elevator pitch in my head, when a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit approached and asked me point blank, "Which one is yours? I've been to 12 of these events this year, and I'm bored out of my mind. Tell me something interesting. Excuse me, your product," he said. "Which booth is yours?" You have the look of someone who's building something real, not someone here to network for the free wine. I laughed, surprised. Verona, skincare. Small, but growing. Never heard of it, he said bluntly. Tell me why I should have. Most people would have been intimidated. I was done being intimidated by powerful men who thought bluntness was a personality trait. Because in 5 years, when Verona is on the shelf of every major department store in this country, you'll wish you'd asked for a sample tonight instead of wasting your bluntness on me, I said. He actually smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all night. "What's your name, Eleanor Whitfield?" "Eleanor," he repeated, like he was testing the weight of it. "Send me your deck tomorrow. If it's half as sharp as your mouth, we'll talk." I sent him the deck at 6 the next morning. He called me by 9. Marcus became my mentor over the following year, though it was never romantic, something the tabloids would later try very hard to imply, and something I'll get to. He was blunt, occasionally infuriating, and completely unwilling to accept excuses. But he saw something in me that even I had stopped believing in during my darkest months. He taught me how to scale, how to negotiate, how to walk into a room full of men who assumed I was someone's assistant and make them remember my name by the time I left. I'll never forget our first real strategy meeting. He sat across from me at a glass conference table, flipped through my financials for maybe 90 seconds, and then slid the folder back across the table. "Your margins are wrong," he said. "You're pricing this like you're still apologizing for existing. Charge what it's worth, not what you think you're allowed to ask for." "I don't want to price out the women who need it most," I said. "Then build a second tier later, once you have the capital to subsidize it properly," he said. "Right now, underpricing yourself isn't generosity, Eleanor. It's self-sabotage wearing a nice outfit. You cannot pour from a cup you refuse to fill." I hated how right he was. I adjusted the pricing that week, terrified I'd lose customers overnight. Instead, sales increased. People trusted the product more once it was priced like it deserved to be trusted. He pushed me constantly, sometimes uncomfortably. He made me pitch to a room of retail buyers 3 times in a row, until I stopped saying "I think" and "sorry, but" before every sentence. He made me negotiate a supplier contract myself instead of letting his team handle it, standing silently in the corner of the room, arms crossed, refusing to intervene even when I visibly struggled because, as he told me afterward, "You needed to know you could do it without me before you ever really believed it." "You've spent 22 years being underestimated," he told me once, during a long strategy session that ran past midnight. "That's not a weakness, Eleanor. That's the sharpest weapon in your arsenal." Nobody sees the blow coming from someone they've already dismissed. I asked him once, half joking, why he'd taken a chance on some unknown 50-year-old woman selling serum out of a foldable table instead of one of the dozens of polished young founders throwing themselves at investors every week in this city. "Because polish is easy to fake and resilience isn't," he said. "Any 25-year-old with a good pitch deck can talk about disruption." "You didn't talk about disruption, Eleanor. You showed up with calluses on your hands from mixing product in your own kitchen at midnight and a spine forged by 22 years of somebody trying to convince you that you were nothing. That's not a founder story you can manufacture. That's just who you are now." I held on to that sentence for a long time. It was the first time in years someone had described my worst chapter as the source of my strength instead of the reason for my shame. Under his mentorship, and honestly under my own relentless work ethic, Verona exploded. We landed a nationwide distribution deal. We were featured in major beauty publications. Within 3 years of that humiliating night in my old kitchen, Verona had grown into a premium beauty and lifestyle brand valued in the tens of millions, with a flagship boutique opening planned in the heart of the city's most prestigious shopping district. I was no longer a simple housewife. I was Eleanor Whitfield, founder and CEO. The flagship boutique launch was set to be the biggest night of my professional life. Press, investors, major retail buyers. Marcus was going to be there, along with half the city's business elite. I had spent months preparing every single detail, down to the lighting. What I didn't know was that Richard and Bianca had been watching my rise from a distance, and they were not happy about it. Here's the thing about people like Richard. Once the excitement of a new relationship fades, once the affair loses its forbidden thrill, what's left is just 2 people and their actual character. And Richard's character, stripped of the house I used to maintain and the stability I used to provide, turned out to be rotten to the core. I later learned, through mutual acquaintances who finally felt comfortable talking once I was no longer the sad ex-wife, that Richard's finances had collapsed within 2 years of our divorce. He'd made a series of terrible investments trying to impress Bianca with a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford: boats, a downtown condo he couldn't keep up with, vacations to keep her happy. He drained what he'd taken from our marriage shockingly fast. Bianca, for her part, was reportedly furious to discover that the successful older man she'd bet her 20s on was, in reality, a man drowning in credit card debt and secret loans, desperately trying to maintain an image. Multiple sources told me she'd started seeing someone else on the side, some wealthy real estate developer, but was keeping Richard around as a financial safety net while things fell apart. Karma, it seems, doesn't wait for permission to start working. And then they saw the press coverage of Verona's success. My face, my name, my company splashed across business and lifestyle magazines. The same woman Richard had told the entire world would starve without him. Instead of humility, instead of shame, what it apparently sparked in both of them was pure jealousy, dressed up as opportunity. 3 weeks before my flagship boutique launch, I started receiving strange messages, vague warnings from industry acquaintances that someone was asking questions about my past. A journalist from a gossip-adjacent business blog reached out for comment on allegations regarding Verona's founding story. I ignored the first few. By the second week, it became impossible to ignore. The full scope of what they were planning became clear 5 days before the gala. Bianca, using a fake industry consultant profile, had been quietly reaching out to some of my smaller investors and retail partners, spreading a manufactured story that Verona's early formulations were stolen from a previous uncredited chemist. It was a complete fabrication, but fabrications don't need to be true. They just need to be loud enough at the right moment. Richard, meanwhile, had been giving interviews to anyone who would listen, painting himself as the long-suffering ex-husband who had funded my entire business during our marriage and was now being written out of the success story entirely. He called me, in one particularly ugly quote to a business gossip column, a bitter woman running a fraud built on my money and someone else's ideas, a bitter fraud. That was the phrase they were pushing. They wanted to detonate that phrase publicly. At the exact moment my boutique launch was getting maximum press attention to inflict the most damage possible. I found out the full details of their plan 4 days before the gala, thanks to a tip from an unlikely source. Richard's own sister Diane, who I'd stayed distantly friendly with even after the divorce, called me in a panic. "Eleanor, I have to tell you something, and I need you to not hate me for knowing this and staying quiet as long as I did," she said. "Richard and Bianca are planning something for your launch. They bought tickets under a fake company name. They're going to show up at the gala and cause a scene in front of the press. They've got some reporter friend lined up to live stream it." My stomach dropped, but underneath the fear, that old familiar fire started burning again. "What exactly are they planning to say? That your entire company is built on stolen research and Richard's money? That you're a fraud? Bianca's been telling people she has proof. I don't know what that proof actually is, if it's even real, but Eleanor, they are desperate. Richard is drowning in debt. I think this is their last shot at either destroying you or extorting some kind of payout out of you to stay quiet. There's one more thing," Diane added, her voice dropping lower. "Bianca's telling people she has some kind of financial proof, too. She's been showing screenshots around, saying she can prove Richard bankrolled your early business, that she has old bank transfers. I don't know if she's bluffing or not, but I wanted you to know exactly what you're walking into." I felt the old fear try to claw its way back up my throat, the same fear that used to keep me quiet in my own kitchen for 22 years. Then I remembered every single receipt I'd kept, every contract I'd signed in my own name, every late night spent making sure nothing about Verona could ever be traced back to a man who hadn't contributed a single dollar. Fear didn't stand a chance against documentation. I thanked Diane, hung up the phone, and sat in silence for exactly 3 minutes. Then I called Marcus. "They're going to try to blow up the launch," I told him, publicly, with press there. There was a pause on the line, and then Marcus said something I'll never forget. "Good. Good, Marcus. This could destroy years of work in one night. Eleanor, listen to me very carefully, he said. You have spent 3 years building an empire on a foundation of receipts, contracts, formulation patents, and verifiable facts. They are building their attack on gossip and desperation. If they're foolish enough to walk into a room full of press and elite investors and try to burn you down with lies, you don't panic. You let them light the match, and then you show everyone in that room exactly who's actually on fire. What do you mean, he said. It's time to prepare a very different kind of presentation for your gala. I didn't sleep much over the next 4 days. I worked with my legal team and my accountant to compile something airtight. Every formulation patent filed under my name years before I ever met Richard for a second time in this new life. Technically, filed under my maiden name during my original cosmetic chemistry studies decades earlier, provable and dated. Every financial document proving Verona had been built entirely on my own capital, my farmer's market earnings, and Marcus's later investment, with zero contribution from Richard, whose name appeared nowhere on a single company document. And, thanks to a forensic accountant Marcus recommended, a certified financial audit into Richard's current business dealings, obtained entirely through legal public record requests, revealing exactly what Diane had warned me about. He was functionally bankrupt, defaulting on 2 business loans, and being actively investigated for misrepresenting his assets to secure a third. I also had something else, something Diane, feeling increasingly guilty about her brother's behavior, had quietly forwarded me, a voicemail Richard left on her phone weeks earlier, drunk and venting, where he openly admitted in his own voice that he planned to make that woman regret ever becoming successful without me and get Bianca to dig up enough dirt to scare her into a payout. I had my ammunition, now I just needed them to actually pull the trigger themselves. The night of the gala arrived. My flagship Verona boutique glowed from 3 blocks away, all soft gold lighting and floor-to-ceiling windows, exactly the image of quiet, expensive elegance I'd worked 3 brutal years to build. Press lined the red carpet. Investors, retail buyers, beauty editors, and city elite filled the boutique, champagne in hand, admiring the product displays I'd personally overseen down to the last shelf placement. I wore a deep emerald gown, my hair styled the way I liked it, not the way Richard used to prefer. I looked in the mirror before walking out onto that floor, and for the first time in years I didn't see Richard's ex-wife. I saw Eleanor Whitfield, founder of a company worth tens of millions, standing on her own 2 feet. Marcus found me backstage before the main presentation. You ready? More ready than I've ever been for anything in my life, I said. They're here, he said quietly. Spotted them near the east entrance 20 minutes ago. Fake company badges, exactly like your sister-in-law said. Let them come in, I said. Let them get comfortable. I walked onto the main floor to warm applause. I gave my opening remarks, thanking my small original team, thanking the retail partners who believed in me early, thanking Marcus for his mentorship, and thanking with quiet emphasis every single person who ever underestimated me, because you taught me exactly how hard I needed to work to prove you wrong. That's when I saw them. Richard, in an ill-fitting rented tuxedo that couldn't hide how much weight stress had put on his face, and Bianca beside him in a dress that looked expensive but was, according to Diane, borrowed from a friend, both of them pushing toward the front near the small stage, flanked by a man holding a phone clearly live-streaming the room. Richard didn't wait for a quiet moment. He never did. He raised his voice, cutting straight through the applause. "Isn't it funny," he called out, loud enough for the cameras and the whole room to hear, "that everyone's celebrating a company built on stolen research and my money, and nobody's asking the real questions?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes turned toward him instantly. A business journalist near the front lifted her phone to record. Bianca chimed in right on cue, her voice sharp and rehearsed. "Eleanor Whitfield built this entire fraud on the back of her ex-husband's finances and someone else's formulations. This whole company is a lie." The room went dead silent. I felt dozens of eyes swing toward me, waiting to see if the simple housewife would crumble under public humiliation the way she used to at home. I did not crumble. I smiled, calm and unbothered, and walked toward the small stage with the microphone. "I was actually hoping you'd show up tonight, Richard," I said, my voice steady and carrying easily through the room. "Saves me the trouble of having to track you down myself." A ripple of confused murmurs went through the crowd. Richard faltered slightly, clearly not expecting composure instead of tears. "Since you've decided to bring up accusations of fraud, in front of the press at my own launch," I continued, "let's actually settle this publicly, right now." I nodded toward my events team. The large screens behind me, originally set to display Verona's brand campaign, switched instead to a different presentation. "This," I said, "is the original filing for the first Verona formulation patent, filed under my maiden name, Eleanor Marsh, dated 2 years before I ever crossed paths with this man again in adulthood, when I was completing my cosmetic chemistry coursework. Every formulation in this company traces back to research I personally developed. There is no stolen research, Richard. There's only a man who never once asked what his wife studied in college, because he was too busy telling her it didn't matter." The room stayed silent, but it was a different kind of silent now, attentive. "Next," I said as the screen changed again, "is the full capital history of Verona, verified by our accounting firm and legal counsel. Every dollar of startup funding traces to my personal earnings after our divorce, and a later investment from Marcus Kane, whose name I'm sure some of you recognize." I gestured toward Marcus standing near the front, arms crossed, watching Richard like a man watching a slow-motion car crash he'd already predicted. "Richard's name does not appear on a single financial document tied to this company, not one, because he did not fund this business. I built it from $11,000 and a foldable table at a farmer's market, after he left me with almost nothing following 22 years of marriage." Richard's face had gone pale under the harsh event lighting. Bianca's confident smirk was starting to crack at the edges. "But since we're addressing fraud tonight," I continued, my voice never wavering, "let's talk about actual fraud." The screen changed one final time, displaying the certified financial audit. "This is a certified, publicly obtainable financial record showing that Richard Whitfield is currently defaulting on 2 separate business loans and is under active review for misrepresenting his assets on a 3rd loan application. Functionally, and I say this with no personal satisfaction whatsoever, my ex-husband is bankrupt." A journalist near the front audibly gasped, already typing furiously into her phone. Whispers spread through the room like wildfire. Bianca grabbed Richard's arm, her face draining of color, clearly realizing in real time that the man she'd bet her future on had absolutely nothing left to offer her. I wasn't finished. "And in case there's any doubt about intent tonight," I said, "I'd like to play one final piece of audio." I nodded, and Richard's own voice filled the room, slightly slurred, unmistakably his from the voicemail Diane had sent me. "I'm going to make that woman regret ever becoming successful without me. Bianca's gonna dig up enough dirt to scare her into paying us to keep quiet, you watch." The room erupted into stunned murmurs and disbelieving laughter. Someone near the back actually started clapping, slow and mocking, and it spread until half the room was applauding, not for Richard, but at the sheer audacity of watching a man publicly expose his own extortion attempt in his own voice. Richard stood frozen. The live stream phone still pointed at him, now capturing his complete public unraveling instead of mine. Bianca had already stepped away from him, putting visible distance between herself and the mess he'd become, her expression shifting from anger to pure, calculating self-preservation. "For the record," I said, quieter now, letting the room settle, "I didn't build Verona to get revenge on anyone. I built it because I refused to let one man's opinion of my worth become the final chapter of my story. But since you two walked in here tonight trying to write yourselves back into that story as villains, I figured the least I could do was give you a proper ending." Marcus stepped up beside me on the small stage, addressing the room directly for the first time that night. "I've backed a lot of founders in my career," he said. "I've rarely seen one with the level of integrity, preparation, and sheer resilience Eleanor has. Everything she just showed you is publicly verifiable. Feel free to check it yourselves. I certainly did, extensively, before I ever invested $1. security quietly summoned by my events team the moment Richard raised his voice, moved in and calmly escorted both Richard and Bianca out of the boutique. Bianca didn't even look back at him as they walked out. The live stream, ironically, kept running the entire time, capturing every second of their public downfall for an audience that would eventually number in the millions once clips of the night went viral the following morning. The gala continued. Champagne kept flowing. Press coverage the next day wasn't about scandal or fraud. It was about the gala confrontation that backfired spectacularly and beauty founder's ice-cold takedown of ex-husband's smear campaign. Verona's sales spiked nearly 40% in the following week, driven by an audience of women, largely my age and older, who saw themselves in my story and wanted to support a brand built by someone who refused to be erased. I thought that would be the end of it. I genuinely thought Richard, humiliated on a global scale, financially ruined and abandoned by Bianca within 48 hours of the gala once she realized there was no money left to extract from him, would simply disappear from my life entirely. He tried one more time 3 weeks later. I was leaving my office late on a Thursday evening when I saw him standing near my car in the parking garage, looking like a shadow of the man who once mocked me in my own kitchen. His suit was wrinkled. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Eleanor," he said, stepping forward. "Please, I need to talk to you." Every instinct from the old version of me, the version trained over 22 years to soften and accommodate and forgive, quietly stirred, and then it settled because that version of me didn't run this company. This version did. I lost everything, he continued, his voice cracking in a way that would have devastated me 3 years earlier. The condo. My accounts are frozen. Bianca left the second the money ran out. She didn't even say goodbye. She just left. I have nowhere to go, Eleanor. You're doing so well now. I know I made mistakes, but we had 22 years together. That has to count for something. I need help. I'm asking you to help me. I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for even a flicker of the old anger, the old hurt, the old humiliation from that night in my kitchen. I found nothing, just a strange, quiet stillness, like looking at a stranger who used to matter a great deal in a story I no longer felt connected to. "Richard," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle, "do you remember what you told me, the night you handed me those divorce papers?" He swallowed hard, saying nothing. "You told me I was a simple housewife who would starve without you," I continued. "You told me I had nothing that was actually mine. You stood in my kitchen, next to a woman half my age, and mocked 22 years of my life like it meant nothing to you." "Eleanor, I was angry. I didn't mean." "I'm not finished," I said, still calm. "I spent a year grieving that. I spent the next 2 years rebuilding myself from $11,000 and a lot of very long nights. I did that without your help, without your money, and honestly, without your love, which I've since realized I probably lost long before that night in the kitchen." "Please," he whispered, "I have nothing left." "I know," I said, "and I want you to understand something clearly so there's no confusion between us going forward. I'm not angry at you anymore, Richard. I don't feel hatred. I don't feel the need to punish you further. What I feel when I look at you is nothing at all." He blinked, clearly having expected tears or rage or at least some flicker of old affection he could exploit. Instead, he got the one thing he never once considered as a possibility: total, unmoved indifference. "You are not my responsibility anymore," I said. "You made that decision yourself in my kitchen, on our anniversary, in front of a woman you thought was going to build a better life with you. I hope, genuinely, that you find your way to some kind of stability, but it will not be through me, not financially, not emotionally, not in any way." 22 years, Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It means I know exactly how much of myself I lost trying to make you happy," I said, "and exactly how much of myself I found again the moment I stopped trying." I opened my car door. "Take care of yourself, Richard," I said, and I meant it in the most distant, final way. A person can mean those words. Not a threat, not cruelty, just an ending. I got in my car, and I drove away, and I did not look back in the mirror even once. Not out of anger. Out of peace. I never heard from him again after that night. Aside from one final, brief update from Diane months later, Richard had moved into a small apartment 2 states away, taken a modest job, and was, according to her, finally facing consequences he'd spent his whole life avoiding. Bianca, last I heard through the industry grapevine, moved on to another wealthy older man within months, chasing the same fantasy that had already burned her once. As for me, Verona is now in over 300 retail locations nationwide, and we're preparing our first international expansion this year. I still work relentlessly, but these days it's out of passion, not desperation. Marcus remains one of my closest advisors and one of my dearest friends. And yes, before you ask in the comments, no, it was never romantic between us, though I understand why people love that theory. Some of the most powerful relationships in your life are the ones built purely on mutual respect. I also started something I never expected to build alongside the business. About a year after the gala, I quietly launched a small mentorship fund through Verona, offering seed grants and hands-on guidance to women over 40 starting over after divorce, job loss, or simply after decades of putting everyone else first. I think about that department store beauty counter often, about Priya taking one look at my dusty old degree and deciding it still mattered. I wanted to be that for someone else. We've funded 11 small businesses so far. Watching those women stand on stage at our annual showcase, describing their own version of the foldable table at the farmer's market, is easily the proudest I've ever felt about anything Verona has built. I got a letter last month from one of them, a woman named Renata, who left an unhappy marriage at 54 and started a small tailoring business with one of our grants. She wrote, "I used to think I was too old to start over. Watching you stand in front of that room and refuse to shrink gave me permission to stop apologizing for wanting more." I keep that letter in my desk drawer, right next to the framed first dollar Verona ever earned at that farmer's market. Every once in a while, a young woman at one of my events will ask me, wide-eyed, how I found the courage to walk away from 22 years of marriage with nothing and start completely over in my 50s. I always tell her the truth. I didn't feel courageous. I felt terrified, humiliated, and furious, in roughly that order, for a very long time. Courage wasn't a feeling I woke up with one morning. It was a decision I made, exhausted and afraid, over and over on every single one of those 18-hour days, long before I had any proof it would actually work out. I think about that night in my kitchen sometimes, the lemon tart, the candles, the manila folder. I used to think it was the worst night of my life. Now I understand it was actually the night my real life began. Richard thought he was ending my story that evening. He had no idea he was simply turning the page. Have you ever found the strength to completely cut out toxic people from your life and watch karma do its job? Or did you feel the need to prove something to them? Comment below. I read all your stories.